My name is Kate Gibson. I'm the Associate Director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. We're very pleased to be putting on this event with the Stanford Center for Law and History, as well as the Department of History. And we're very happy to have Judge M. Margaret McKeown here to talk about her new book, Citizen Justice, The Environmental Legacy of William O. Douglas, Public Advocate and Conservation Champion. Judge McKeown has served for 25 years as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an affiliated scholar at the Lane Center, and jurist in residence at the University of San Diego School of Law. As a former White House fellow, she served as special assistant at the White House and as a special assistant to the Secretary of the Interior. She's a Wyoming native and serves on the board of Teton Science Schools and was a member of the first American expedition to Mount Shishapanga in Tibet, which sounds amazing. I'd love to hear about that sometime. She graduated from Georgetown University Law Center and holds an honorary doctorate also from Georgetown. Before her appointment, she was the first woman partner at Perkins Coie in Seattle and DC. She is joined by Emily Greenfield, who we're also very happy to have with us tonight, who is a Stanford PhD candidate in US history, studying slavery in American memory. Her research explores constructions of the past in public space, the remembering and forgetting that unfolds in textbooks and museums, on tour at historic sites and across the built landscape of America's memorials and monuments. Before entering her doctoral program, Emily was a producer at CBS News and a member of the leadership team of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation in Monticello. So I will turn it over to Judge McKeown in a second, but I just wanted to thank you again for being here. Judge McKeown, thank you.
Thank you for the gracious introduction, and particularly thank you to the Bill Lane Center for the American West and Stanford Law School and the History Department here. In particular, I want to thank the Lane Center because I was there some years ago talking with them about the prospect of this book, and the book was not yet a book. And when I finished, Bruce Kane said, well, is there some way we could work with you or help you? I didn't even know what he meant. And he said, you know, like a research assistant. Well, that was music to my ears. And I said, fantastic. And as a result, the Lane Center was incredibly generous in sponsoring a PhD student for me to help me. And she's actually here today, and she's one of my law clerks, Magdalene Zier. Also, I'm joined by another Stanford alum, Alexandra Willingham, who also graduated here at Stanford Law School. But I don't want you to think I only hire Stanford students, although Tanner Allred is here, and also a PhD student and law student, and he'll be coming next year. But I also want you to acknowledge from the University of Chicago, another very, very prestigious institution, Becky Rivas-Gonzalez, one of my other law clerks. Now, when I was going to law school, which was a few years ago, William O. Douglas was a household word because he was a very prominent justice on the US Supreme Court. And he's remembered for many things, such as his 4 wives, his potential impeachment led by then Congressman Gerald Ford, some of the names they called him, some people called him William Zero Douglas, and others called him a communist. But that is probably somewhat interesting and salacious, but that's not what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon. My topic instead is the environmental legacy. Justice Douglas is the longest serving justice ever, 36 years, 1939 to 1975. And he was a champion dissenter. He was very fascinating, but I have to confess he was also flawed. So I thought I would talk with you some about how did I get into this topic. There's the Murray Ranch in Moose, Wyoming, right on the grounds of the Grand Teton National Park. And I was snowshoeing one day, And I snowshoed in. I was literally on top of that roof trying to figure out, how do I get down from here? Where am I, actually? And a guy came out, and I said, where am I? And he said, oh, you're at the Murray Center. And I very, of course, confidently said, I know, John Muir. John Muir. He said, no, Murray, M-U-R-I-E. I had to confess, I had no idea who the Murrays were, but it turns out that they were very famous conservationists. She's sometimes called the grandmother of conservation, and Olaus Murray was the president of the Wilderness Society. And this ranch was conservation's home. So one thing led to another, and I began to look at some of their archives, and I saw this letter from William O. Douglas on Supreme Court stationery to the Murrays that said, why don't you turn over this homestead to the national park? And I thought, well, that's pretty presumptuous to say, give me your house, give away your house. So I thought, well, how is it that Justice Douglas, very well known and prestigious, knows these humble people from Wyoming? Well, in the long run, in fact, they did turn over their ranch to the National Park Service as a home for conservation and a sanctuary for people to talk about environmental and conservation issues. So after I saw that letter, I was somewhat intrigued. So I thought, well, why don't I see what else Justice Douglas was up to? So I went to the Library of Congress, where all of his papers are, and began to plow through a few. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So then I went to Denver, and I looked at the Wilderness Society. And then I came to Berkeley, where the Sierra Club papers are. And one thing led to another. And so what I think started out as a lark led to a book. Everyone said, well, you should write a book. I said, I write opinions, not books. And on the other hand, this was a story I felt was worth telling. And so that's how I got into it. Some of you may not be completely familiar with Justice Douglas, so let me give you a sense of who was or is Justice Douglas. Well, he was a very sickly kid. He had polio, and he was bullied. And to overcome that, he went out into the wilderness, and he would hike, he would camp, he was learning the flora, the fauna, and he became someone whose sanctuary was the wilderness. Now, he was also a star student. His mother called him Treasure, and here is her goal for him, to be president of the United States. So no pressure there. I don't know if any of your parents had that in mind. Certainly my mother did not. But as a star student, he then went on to a small liberal arts college, Whitman College, and he did very well there. He was in a fraternity, he was class president. And then he rode the rails, literally, to Columbia Law School. And he came from a family that was poor, not probably dirt poor, but poor. Their father had died when he was fairly young. And as a result, he actually had a real sense of people. He worked in the field with migrant workers. He picked apples. He worked at a dry goods store, a drugstore. So he was always trying to earn money to help the family. And that really influenced who he is and who he was and what he thought about the world. So he gets to Columbia, and that's really quite a stretch to move from Yakima, Washington, where he was born, to New York City, where he had never been. He rocketed to the top, did really well at Columbia Law School, and when he got there to earn money, he actually was commissioned to write a book for undergraduates on business law. He didn't know anything about business law, but he needed the money, so he did that. But you know what struck him about being there is there were no trees, or very few trees. He had like one little measly plant in his window. By now he was married to a teacher whom he had met in Yakima. So he finishes law school. And as is often said at law school, the brass ring is to get a Supreme Court clerkship. He did not get the Supreme Court clerkship. Someone else got it. He thought he deserved it, but he didn't get it. But here's the amazing thing. 14 years later, he's on the US Supreme Court. So take yourself, imagine yourself 14 years from now, when you graduate from Stanford Law School or from history PhDs, that you would be on the US Supreme Court. So he then gets onto the court in 1939. He's only 40 years old. And before he got onto the court, he had kind of a very interesting meteoric rise. And you'll see he can't keep a job for too long. So first he goes to Cravath, Swaine, and Moore. He says that is deadly boring for him. So maybe he should just go back home to Washington and try to practice law out west. So he goes out west, and he's offered a job by my former law firm in Seattle, Perkins Coie, and they offer him something in the neighborhood of $500 a month. Cravath says, how about $6,000 if you would come back to New York? And so he was lured back to New York, and he found out, it actually didn't get more interesting, even though they paid him more money. So then he became a law professor. He started at Columbia, and then he went to Yale. And again, he's just sort of like every few years, he seems to be changing jobs. His area of focus was business law. Nobody would believe that now, given his reputation for the environment and also civil rights. But it was a time of the country coming out of the Depression. He's working on bankruptcy, and he catches the eye of Joseph Kennedy, who is chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So he goes down to Washington, and he starts to meet people in Washington. Kennedy is very taken with him, and he starts really as a researcher or a project person, and before long, he's actually commissioner. So you can start to see a pattern here. He becomes commissioner of the SEC. A couple years later, he becomes the chair. Kennedy steps down. And then Roosevelt hears that Brandeis is stepping down from the court. So he wants to appoint a Westerner. The problem is, for half of his life, Douglas has been back east. So is he really a Westerner? Well, he went to great lengths to prove I am a Westerner, and he really was. He was a child of the West. The West was really ingrained in who he is, who he was, and he came back, and the Yakima Bar Association says, we want one of our own. Some years later, they were kind of backtracking on that, saying, he's not one of our own, when he made decisions that they didn't particularly like. But he becomes a Supreme Court justice. At one point, he's in Washington, he's hobnobbing with Roosevelt, with ambassadors, with cabinet members. Roosevelt calls him in, and he's really worried. He thinks he's going to make me an offer to be the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, and that would be deadly. So he goes in, and Roosevelt says, I want to offer you a job that's like being in jail, at which point he knows he is going to be the chairman of the FCC. And Roosevelt says, no, I want you to be on the US Supreme Court. He cannot believe his amazing luck that he's going to be on the US Supreme Court. When he is ultimately nominated, it's 1 day, 2 days between nomination and confirmation, something you wouldn't see today. So now he's on the US Supreme Court, 14 years out of law school. And one of the early cases that he heard was called O'Malley versus Woodruff. Here's the issue. The issue is, should federal judges pay income tax? And of course, I might have a personal view on that, but I have to abide by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, well, of course they should pay income tax. They're citizens like everybody else. And so Douglas then writes in his little journal that he has just voted himself first-class citizenship, and that he can do whatever he needs to do or wants to do as long as it doesn't interfere with the court. And so that's where I get the title Citizen Justice, is because I felt that at that moment he conceived himself in a little bit different way. And he was not just a justice on the Supreme Court, but he was also a citizen. And then he combines the two and becomes a citizen justice. Now, that first decade on the court, you'd think he would be, jump into high heavens about being a justice on the Supreme Court. But he's also angling in politics. So when Roosevelt is going to choose a vice president, Douglas proclaims no interest. In fact, during the Democratic Convention, he had a phone hooked up from a cabin in Oregon all the way to the post office. But I might add, he had no interest in what was happening at the Democratic Convention. So he had his way of being a little disingenuous from time to time. So there was supposedly a piece of paper, and it either said Truman, Douglas, or it said Douglas, Truman. It's disputed. And did Roosevelt prefer Douglas, or did he prefer Truman? What were the higher-ups in the Democratic Party saying? We don't know, but what we do know is that Roosevelt chose Truman, and Truman became our vice president. So at this point, he's now kind of seeing his political hopes dashed. He's actually even a little bored. Then Roosevelt dies, which is really hard for him because he felt like Roosevelt was almost like a father figure. So Roosevelt dies, Truman becomes president, and who does he ask to be his vice president? William O. Douglas. Douglas then says, no, why be number two to a number two? So he then at this point has pretty well dashed any political hopes. But he is bored on the court. He's a genius. Justice Brennan said one of the very few geniuses he'd ever met. And his marriage is breaking up. And then he has almost a near catastrophic horse accident out in Washington State. He's riding along in the Cascade Mountains, and all of a sudden the horse rolls on, he falls off, 1,600 pounds, boom, right on top of him. And he broke 23 ribs. And I didn't even know we had 23 ribs, to be honest. So at that point, he has a time to think about life. He's realizing the marriage is crumbling. He writes a book at that point called Of Men and Mountains. Many people have read it. And it really talks about his relationship with nature and with the environment and a lot of his adventures, his boyhood adventures. And as time goes on, we're now into the 50s, it's pretty clear that he's looking for something more than the Supreme Court. But it's not going to be politics, as we know. And then he enters what I call well, there he is in the Supreme Court in 1939. And there he is with O'Malley v. Woodruff. And like he says, you should be a citizen like everyone else. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is how he conceived of this notion of being a citizen like everyone else. Well, he did that in a number of ways, one of which is dissenting on the road. And here he is marching, this particular is down the CNO Canal. So the CNO Canal, has anybody been to the CNO Canal in Washington, D.C.? It's 189 miles, starts in D.C., goes up to Cumberland, Maryland, and it's an historic canal where we used to have a lot of commerce that would be coming down to D.C. But the Park Service had a really good idea. They said, why not put a highway along the side of the CNO Canal? Then people could get to it easier. The Washington Post has an editorial. We support a highway on the CNO Canal. Douglas is outraged, so he writes a letter to the editor. A Supreme Court justice writes a letter to the editor of the Washington Post and basically says, you know, you're wrong. This is a place of sanctuary, of beauty. It needs to be preserved. And here's what he does. He challenges them, that is the Post editors, to come with him on this 189-mile hike that he's planning. And they finally accept. Of course, they think it's just going to be kind of lollygagging in the park. They, of course, do not go 189 miles for sure, but he does. And there were 9 people who finished that hike, including Olaus Murie, hearkening back to that cabin in Wyoming. And while they're on the hike, Douglas planned this pretty strategically. One of the beautiful things about research is that you can go into the manuscript division of the Library of Congress or other places and see the actual documents. So I looked at his calendar for the day of the hike, and here's what it said. Hike. That's it. And what a hike it was, because it changed his life. So he goes on the hike. There were no women on this particular hike. And here they are marching down on Cino Canal. He sets it up so they land in Washington, D.C. You could go either way, but no, he wants publicity. He's here with Secretary of Interior, with all these other people. He's shaking hands. And along the way, they meet all kinds of people. And when they're done, Douglas realizes this is a very special place. So he does what he often does, and that is he sees this threatened place. He forms a committee. He, of course, is the chair of that committee, forms the committee, and then they begin to lobby members of Congress. They spread out in the community, become community organizers. And in this case, they had to convince the National Park Service, do not put a highway down that canal. And you can see here in the colored picture what that canal looks like. Well, lo and behold, the people on the hike, particularly the Washington Post, they changed their mind. And so they actually ran another editorial in the Post that said they were wrong, which is very rare. They were wrong, and there should be no highway run down there. And so, years later, after much lobbying and many years, this becomes the William O. Douglas National Historic Park. And if you go to Georgetown today, you'll see a bust at the beginning of the canal, and that's William O. Douglas. And the Park Service is very proud of the canal today, and they say it's the only park that was actually walked into existence. So he's now kind of put his, staked his claim that he's a big conservation person. And he's not just a Supreme Court justice, but he's a citizen who's out there for conservation. While on the hike, Mr. Murray talks with him about Alaska and says this is an incredibly threatened area, and we're planning a scientific expedition there to document what's happening in terms of potential degradation of the Arctic. Not only problems with oil and gas and possible drilling and deforestation and that sort of thing. And he invites Douglas to come along. So Douglas says, okay. He doesn't go on the whole expedition, but he goes to Alaska. And while he's up there, he's just a member of, the camp crew. Also, there was, this time, women came along. So Mrs. Murray, the grandmother of conservation, Marty Murray came along. There was a female ornithologist from the University of Alaska. And Marty Murray was actually the first female to graduate from the University of Alaska. So they're up there, they're collecting specimens, they're hiking, and he might ask, like, Justice Douglas, do you want some hot chocolate? Justice Douglas, and he'd go, no, call me Bill. So when he's on the trail, and when he's out there with the people who are his people, he's a very humble guy who's incredibly accessible. So when they finish this hike, the Murrays spread out like missionaries across Alaska to convince Alaskans this needs to be saved. This is a piece of America that needs to be saved. Douglas goes back and he writes a chapter in one of his books. Now he, over time, wrote about 50 books, if you can imagine. So he writes about 50 books, and in this chapter, he really extols the beauty of the Arctic. And in doing that, he really gives it a real presence outside of Alaska. And then he's, of course, turning the levers of power quietly back in Washington, D.C. Now, Douglas Brinkley, an historian, says that if you dealt with Douglas and negotiated with him, it had all the pleasure of shaving with a blowtorch. So he could be a tough customer when he was on a mission, as he was. He was on a mission, the Murrays were on a mission. Ultimately, Eisenhower puts it into monument status. It then becomes monument status again in later years under Carter, until finally the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act passed in 1980, preserving not only huge swaths of the Arctic, but Southeast Alaska and other parts of Alaska. So if you look at a map of Alaska today, what you see there was something begun by the Murrays and by Douglas. Well, now he's really on a roll. He seems to enjoy this hiking and hollering, as it was called. And so he saved a coast in Washington, where again, they were going to put a highway down the coast. And he's like, why would you put a highway down the last piece of American wilderness that's on a coast in the lower 48? And ultimately, he's successful there. So he has a number of these, and he's saving all over the country. He's really, really busy protesting. And it's not just a mild, like, I think this is a bad idea. He's out there, for example, with people who say, bird watchers go home. We want a highway, not a justice. And, you know, all kind of protest placards with him out there. And, you know, again, people brought to his attention threatened places. So I think that one of the things I want to show you is here he is in Alaska. Now, one thing I wanted to say, we probably have some hikers and walkers here. He hiked 5 to 6 miles an hour, which is really, I mean, mind-boggling. And he was a tall guy, as were some of the other people there. But you can see him with the camera. He's always with a camera around his neck. He loved to take pictures. But as one of his friends said, he liked even more when people would take a picture of him. So that's what's happening here. And that's Marty Murray in that red plaid shirt there. So he's now dissenting on the road, and it's all over the United States. You know, it's Maine, it's Texas, wherever. And that's not enough. Here he is on the beach. He's also protesting in the corridors of power. And to me, this is one of the most surprising things that I saw in his papers and all of the various papers around the country, is that you had a Supreme Court justice that basically ran a one-man lobby shop from the Supreme Court. How did he do this? Well, he told his colleagues he thought the work only took 3-4 days a week, so he had a lot of extra time. Now, as you know, that wouldn't be a way to endear yourself to your other colleagues particularly. But here he is, you know, now he's dissenting in the corridors of power. And I made up this little business card for him. Of course, this is a fake business card. But it says, you know, Associate Justice, United States Supreme Court, and then Supreme Conservation Advocate, which he was. And in the process, he was going to the highest levels. Here he is with Jack Kennedy, and there he is with Lyndon Johnson. Now with Kennedy, he was not in office long enough for Douglas to have a long relationship, although he had a very close relationship with Bobby, but he was close to the Kennedys. And the Kennedys, as you know, are kind of seen as blue bloods, Massachusetts blue bloods. And what Douglas says to Jack Kennedy is, you know, the trouble with you, Jack, you never slept on the ground, which was true. He probably had never slept in a sleeping bag. Now, Johnson was a more complicated individual. Johnson, of course, served longer. And he liked Johnson. He even said at one point that if Johnson asked him, he would step down and become vice president for Johnson, but that never happened. So Johnson was the president and signed the Wilderness Act. And Johnson had signed a lot of environmental legislation in the 60s. So he had very significant environmental credentials. But Douglas kind of somehow dismissed him as a true environmentalist. He loved Lady Bird, and we all know that she did a lot for the environment, including all of her beautified highways. Douglas wrote a book called Farewell to Texas, one of his many books, and Lady Bird was livid. She thought that was so dismissive of Texas as a state, as an ecosystem, and he didn't change the title. I mean, he went through there and he said, look, here's what's happening because of oil companies, here's what's happening in the rivers, here's what's happening to some of the scrubland. It is farewell to Texas if Texas doesn't wake up. So here he is, he's always kind of jawboning with the president. And if he can't get a good answer out of somebody lower down, he just goes to the president. Now, he also had enemies, or I should say, he viewed them as enemies. And he had a list of 10 major enemies in the United States. And you're probably looking at this going, Playboy magazine? What is the justice doing writing for Playboy magazine? Well, here's what he said. That's what young men read. And I want to talk to all of America. So it's true. I mean, he wrote for Ladies' Home Journal, for Good Housekeeping, National Geographic, just a wide range of publications. But in this one called The Public Be Damned, he said, enemy number one is the Army Corps of Engineers. And he basically says they're the despoilers because they create dams. So early on, Douglas was opposed to dams. Roosevelt, of course, faced with his economic situation, was in favor of dams, and a lot of dams were being built all around the United States. And Douglas is saying no. I mean, that really contributes to environmental degradation. It changes the whole fish habitat, and the Army Corps of Engineers is number one responsible for this. So he was attacking agencies publicly in magazines. And here's something to remember. Like right now, if you write for a magazine, they literally don't pay you. People are like thrilled to get published. They used to pay you back then. And remember, he has some alimony hanging out in the background. So it's good to get a little supplement to your income. But he's very clear about this. And, the other thing, and let me just read you a part of this, is that he's not only talking with the presidents, and he's talking with agencies, Forest Service, the Park Service, but he's deep into talking with members of Congress. The intricate dance between Congress and the agencies administering federal environmental policies meant Capitol Hill was prime territory for Douglas to exert his influence. That the Capitol was just a few blocks away from the Supreme Court allowed Douglas to develop important relationships with members of Congress, especially those from the West. And the adage, all politics are local, held true in the conservation world. Douglas knew that while agency policy is made in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters, implementation takes place on the ground. So he understood all politics are local, and he teamed up with two of the senators from Washington State, Magnuson and Jackson, sometimes called the Twin Towers of Power, because they brought home the bacon on all the federal grants and important expenditures in Washington State. And so they were his heroes. And he talked to everybody in Congress. If there was an issue, if it's in Maine, he's talking to the senator from Maine. If it's in Alaska, it didn't matter. So he's dissenting in the corridors of power in a way that had not really happened before on a single subject by a Supreme Court justice. Now, of course, we also can't forget he was on the Supreme Court, and he's dissenting there as well. He really was a champion dissenter in the US Supreme Court. And he dissented almost 500 times, 500 times. And of those 500, in 40% of the cases, he was the only dissenter. So that kind of tells you about where did he fit inside the court. Sometimes he would say, the only soul I have to save is my own. Other times he would jawbone with the justices, but often he wouldn't. He'd come to the end of the term. We know it ends at the end of June. And he had a cabin out in Washington State. And if he'd written his dissent or his majority, he'd just jump on the plane and fly out to his cabin. That, too, was not looked upon very favorably, by his colleagues. And when we think of champion dissenters, sometimes in the more recent past, people think, oh, Justice Scalia. He was a major dissenter on the court, as was Justice Stevens, who followed Justice Douglas. But Scalia paled really in comparison to Douglas. So The important thing to remember about Douglas on the court is that while I'm talking with you about his environmental legacy, and I'll talk about Sierra Club v. Morton, one of his most famous cases, there were a number of other cases in the civil rights area, particularly in the First Amendment area, and also, as I say, in personal liberty area. He wrote the majority in Griswold v. Connecticut, which is very much in the news now in terms of the right to privacy. And sometimes you'll see that ridiculed, but remember, it was a 7-2 decision, and so the other 6 of those justices joined Justice Douglas. So now we come to a case that involves Mineral King Valley. That's here in California. Sierra Nevada's beautiful place. But Walt Disney wants to build a ski resort here. And this is what it would have looked like if they had put the ski resort here. So the Sierra Club was totally apoplectic about this option. So it sues to stop the resort. And once again, there's a highway issue because the only way you're going to get in here and have it be a ski resort so you can get a lot of cars, you have to build and expand the highway. So the highway figures in, as does the degradation of the valley. And here, the Sierra Club had a very novel idea. Instead of saying, our members are hikers here or bird watchers, they said, who is really damaged? The valley, the river, the mountain. That's who's damaged. And that's in whose name we should sue. So instead of being called Sierra Club v. Morton, which is how you read it if you look up in your textbook or on Lexis, Douglas thought, why it should have been called the mountain or the valley versus Morton. Well, that worked in the district court. And they went then to the Ninth Circuit, where the Ninth Circuit said, no, you don't really have standing. You are it's the wrong party to sue. You don't have somebody from the Sierra Club who's been damaged. And then it comes to the Supreme Court. So now it's in the Supreme Court. And in my view, this case was made for Douglas. And of course, he was made for this case. But the question is, should he have sat on this case? Because before the case came to the Supreme Court, he'd been a member of the Sierra Club board a number of years ago. He had resigned, so no direct connection there. But he was out hiking and protesting with the Sierra Club not long before the case comes to the Supreme Court. And he's also a life member of the Sierra Club. So he writes a letter to the Sierra Club that says something to this effect. I am a life member. I used to be a board member. And it's possible that a case could come to the court in which the Sierra Club was a party. I don't know of one, but it could come. But if it did come, I want to make sure that I'm not a life member. I therefore resign, which he does. Now, it's interesting because at the time, we see Sierra Club in the courts all the time now, or Earth Justice, or related parties. That was very unusual back then. Sierra Club was not a major litigant in the court. So he decides to sit on the case, and there's a lot of scuttlebutt. Should he be sitting on the case? Is this an ethical conflict? It was discussed particularly among law clerks. I had an opportunity to interview most of his living law clerks, some of whom were there in the surrounding time, and also clerks to other justices. So was he going to sit? And the answer was, yeah, he decided that he would sit. So the case is argued, and at the time it's being argued, there's a law professor out at USC named Stone, and he writes an article about should trees have standing. And through a series of machinations, that finds its way to Justice Douglas. It's unpublished. He doesn't know Stone, but a law clerk bootlegs that to him. And so after the argument, Douglas sits down and he zips off his dissent in 2 hours. Pretty amazing. Very fast writer, very fast. And you can see all of his drafts, pasted, cut, and all this in the archives. And he really felt, I think in this case, that the court had gone astray because why wouldn't a valley or a mountain have standing? Because that is who is actually injured. A corporation is an inanimate object. That can be a plaintiff, a ship, for example. So here's what Douglas writes. And he's writing here in the spirit almost of Thoreau, the Sand County Almanac, and all this history of conservation and nature writing. And what he basically says is the voice of this inanimate object shouldn't be stilled. Here's the bits of Americana, valleys, alpines, rivers, meadows. They should be heard. Very eloquent. He writes this thing and then he hands it to his law clerk and he says, put in some footnotes backwards. And of course, he didn't spare the chance to beat up on the Forest Service and various other federal agencies in this opinion. Justice Black joined him and also wrote a very eloquent dissent. Case goes back to the district court and they take the hint, so they bring in a couple of Sierra Club members who would be damaged by this. And while all this is going on, ultimately Disney gives up the ship. Environmental processing and environmental statements being processed, and they just finally decide they're not going to do it. And so you now have Mineral King Valley. And the important thing for Douglas, it's like when we talked to Justice Ginsburg, she said her dissents were writing for the future. He knew this was not going to be adopted by the court, but he was writing for the future. And if you look around America, it hasn't really been integrated into our law, except there's a number of municipalities that have ordinances that reflect rights of nature. And if you go overseas, for example, the Maori and New Zealand came to a resolution to give standing in effect to a mountain and a river. And it's also in the Constitution of some other countries. So he made an impact here. But at the time, some people viewed this as laughable. Others viewed it really more as a soliloquy to nature. And this is who Douglas is. So here he is, he's dissenting in his own backyard too. There he is on the bottom with Kathy Douglas, his fourth wife. She was 23 when they married, he was 67. She went on to law school and became a very proficient and admired environmental attorney, and is now both an environmental attorney and a philanthropist. Up top there are two women from the Double K Ranch, so they called them the Double K Girls, and he was very good friends with them. They also were called the Blister Sisters, because when the Forest Service saw them coming, yikes, they knew they were in for a big lobbying situation. So they and Douglas were made for each other, and they used to sit out and drink special drinks made for Douglas. He'd call from, the airport when he got in, and they'd start mixing the drinks. So he is very, very close to a number of people. And, it leaves you this question. Here's his house in Goose Prairie, Washington. And after I got out of law school, and he had retired from the court, then he died. And a group of lawyers got together and said, oh, maybe we should buy this cabin and make it into some kind of preserve. And of course, the problem was it wasn't for sale. We were also young lawyers and we had no money, and that was that. But in a really twist of irony, eventually it became for sale, and one of my former partners bought it and has restored it to exactly how Douglas had it. So in Washington, he saved a mountaintop from being a gold mine. He saved rivers. He was responsible for various rivers not being dammed. So he was very active here. But in particular, this whole area where his cabin is incredible wilderness, but it wasn't protected as wilderness. And so when he died, the Blister Sisters and others kept trying to make it a wilderness. And finally, Washington's two Republican senators were formidable forces, and they pushed through the William O. Douglas Wilderness. And I think it's interesting what Senator Kennedy said at the time. In the congressional record, he said, if we're to single out the one person most responsible for awakening this nation to the hazards of inaction, while our natural resources dwindled and decayed, it is to Justice Douglas we owe our deepest gratitude. And now, if you are standing in Washington State, anywhere in the William O. Douglas Wilderness, you can look, and this is what you'll see. You'll see Mount Rainier, which he could see from his home as a child, and he could also see Mount Adams. So it's a real tribute to Douglas. People then often say, well, but what's his legacy? What's his legacy? My feeling is that he is a hero, but he's an imperfect hero. And I'm not sure why we always demand that heroes be perfect, because he's not a perfect hero. He brought us ethical challenges that we should think about today in terms of judicial ethics. And then he also makes us think about what are the pros and cons of being a contrarian. But there are also upsides to always being a contrarian. And the other thing I would say is he was a canary in the coal mine. So way back, he was talking about pollution. He was talking about pesticides. He was talking about dams, many of which are now coming down because of the environment for the fish. And he was also talking about the importance of transparency in the administrative process. So he was ahead of his time in so many ways. And I would say that his environmental legacy cannot be overstated. Here is the last part of the book. Douglas was a legal giant, a genius, a conservation hero, and a public philosopher. He always said he was talking to the next generation. And were he to look back on his remarkable journey, Douglas would despair at the environmental challenges facing the planet today. But he would delight that his relentless faith and intervention did leave the earth more beautiful than when he came. And that was his hope. And now many rivers run free, choice pieces of wilderness have been saved, and the trees are still standing. Thank you for sharing the Douglas journey.
So, surrounded by brilliant legal minds, present company included, in the law school, I'm going to exercise my historian's prerogative here and ask you a question about sources. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned this a little bit, but I'm struck in reading this, right, you capture this incredibly complicated figure. He's restless and brilliant and at times contradictory, which makes me wonder how you come to find him in the sources. So what does his archive look like? And what other sources do you go looking for to really get a sense of his story?
That's a great question. Well, his archive is in the Library of Congress, and you have there all of his papers, which include some childhood papers, some writings, but mostly after he's in a law school professor and he's at the SEC, quite a few SEC papers. So you start to get his personality, and then you have his court papers. And the court papers consist of basically, you can now see how did people vote at conference, whether to take a case or not. He was pretty taciturn. He would usually say yes or no. Others would go on and on. His nemesis was Frankfurter. And then you can read all of his correspondence. He's a total pack rat. So I can read every letter from somebody in Ohio who says, Justice Douglas, I'm concerned about pesticides. I'm concerned about pollutants in the river. What should I do? And then he says, here's what you should do. Here's who you should call. Carry on, that sort of thing. So you really get a sense of him through his letters and also his opinions in terms of how he writes. So his opinions are one thing, but he also kept diaries. Every hike, he has a diary for.
These are the little black books.
These are the black books. He writes the name of everybody who went on the hike. And then he writes comments. And I didn't find those to be particularly profound, but I thought they were interesting. And he then takes that and he turns it into a chapter in a book. So he kind of goes from, pen to book. And then he has a lot of correspondence, for example, with the Murrays. And so you see a whole, whether it's Christmas cards or I was at your house, I used your telephone, here's $1.25, you know? And he's, so with a lot of people, he had this really incredible personality. But then that's his archive, right? Then you go to the Wilderness Society, with whom he had a lot of dealings, or the Sierra Club, and you see the other side of the correspondence if it hadn't been preserved at the Supreme Court. Or some of the people he hiked with in Washington State, you can see their archives at the University of Washington, or the Sierra Club at the Bancroft Library, or some of the things with Johnson or Kennedy. So we really kind of are piecing together his voice and his documents. I worry, maybe as a historian you have an answer, what will happen with just email? I wouldn't have any of this if it were just email, was my feeling. So my happiest moments were just sitting in the library reading, and I wasn't necessarily going to write a book. And so then when I decided to write a book, it seemed, oh, now I have to actually take all of this and turn it into a story, which it is a story. But I would be just as happy today if I were sitting at the Library of Congress in the middle of all of his archives, because they're fascinating. He has photos, he has specimens. He traveled all over Tibet, Persia, Iran, what we call Iran, Russia, you name it, India. That's very unusual for someone at that time. He was not only a hiker, he was a mountain climber. So I guess you get all the raw material, and then you begin to see a picture of who he is. And I should last say, the interviews. I interviewed as many people as I could. Turns out people like to talk. All you have to do is call up and say, are you willing to chat? Absolutely. Off and running.
I have to tell you, this sounds like the archive that historians dream about. So magical. I noticed as well in your acknowledgments that you thanked family for traveling with you as you did research for this book. And it made me wonder to what extent nature itself was an archive for you. So did you retrace Douglas's steps on any of these protests? How did that factor into the way that you thought about them?
Well, I did some. I sometimes had to drag my family. But, in Alaska, going up to the Arctic, I went on a big raft trip in the Arctic. And of course, I've spent a lot of time in Wyoming, where he spent time, and in the Wind Rivers and in Colorado. There is a little book that someone put together. It's really a lovely book that retraces a lot of his hikes. It gives you the maps for hiking. I didn't try to hike everywhere he hiked. But in law school, I went to Georgetown. I was on the Cino Canal all the time. And when I was training for this expedition to Tibet, I was training at sea level, which isn't the best place to train for a 26,000-foot mountain, but every night I was on the CNO Canal. So when I made that connection, it just made the CNO Canal all the more, meaningful for me. I did spend a lot of time in the outdoors and in places that he had been, but he didn't try to recreate the sense of all the places he had been.
So,
or I would still be
I was going to say, or we'd be walking with you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk more about the citizen justice. To start, I'm wondering if you can reflect a bit on how Douglas defined conservation, right? So what did this concept mean to him?
Right. Well, I do have a chapter in the book that goes back to really some of the history of conservation. So everybody's familiar with Thoreau. We're familiar with Teddy Roosevelt. And at that time, conservation often tended to be focused on a particular thing, like the Audubon Society is birds. And Teddy Roosevelt was big on big game. Thoreau was more of a nature person. And as time went on, conservation got loosely translated into conserving, but also having more multiple uses. It then began to collide with preservation. And preservationists tend to be more rigid and not necessarily as embracing of other uses of, say, the wilderness and other things. So Douglas started, I think, as a conservationist. He did fish. He did not hunt, and he purposefully did not hunt. But the longer he was in it, the more he felt, we can't conserve it, we better preserve it. Because once we don't preserve it, then it's going to be gone. So that's where you move into this. And then the other thing, I use the words loosely now, environmentalism. That word wasn't even used in the US Supreme Court till 1972.
And he uses it
And
for the first time, right?
And you know, we think about it now, it's used all the time. But when he left the court, he was in a very frustrating position because the country had passed the National Environmental Policy Act. And there were a number of really important areas that were being threatened. And the court wouldn't take those. He was incredibly frustrated. So he wrote a lot of dissents. And even today, according to Professor Lazarus at Harvard, the Supreme Court has still not ruled in favor of an environmental group in a NEPA or National Environmental Policy Act case. So by the end of his time, Douglas is beating his head against the wall. And he just is having trouble reconciling, here's a new law that's been passed, why are we not accepting cases on it? And at the same time, another area that was of great interest to him were Indian or Native rights. And if he could, he would tip the scale to the natives. But when the natives collided with the fish, that was another issue. And so in those cases, he often, one might say, sided with the fish as opposed to the fishermen or fisher people. So he had a lot of conflicts in his kind of wheelhouse as well. He was absolutely an absolutist on the First Amendment, and that's where he, you know, was incredibly consistent through his whole time on the court. And you know, he has other cases in the criminal law area which are important as well. But I think his environmental cases, what they give you is a snapshot of what's happening in the court during that period. And then when he leaves the court, beginning in the 80s and the 90s, you begin to see kind of a change in how the court is dealing with environmental cases, environmental issues.
So is it fair to say that he is a founder or a forefather of environmentalism, if we're using that term kind of loosely? Is he joining a movement, or is he helping to define that movement in his advocacy?
That's a great question. I think it's both. I describe him, I think he's a band leader for the conservation movement. And the conservation movement, you know, has been loosely divided into different periods, as there was, you know, the saving, and then there was the fighting, the more active, and then there was the defensive posture that came about. Douglas was there in all of those, and he'd been there in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But a lot of this conservation movement took place, like the founding of the Wilderness Society, back in the 30s. And then if you go way back. So I think he's a successor to a long history of men. There was Rosalie Edge, who they said was a radical environmentalist. There were very few women in the conservation movement. So he is a successor to these men in the conservation movement as it moves into what we think of now as the environmental movement. And I think he took pride in the fact that the environmentalists looked up to him as a figurehead. And who's better to lead your cause than a U.S. Supreme Court justice?
So I want to talk to you more about his tactics as an advocate. One of the things I found really striking about the book is that you show us all of these ways. On the one hand, in the kind of public sphere, he becomes this masterful sort of consensus builder. And yet, on the court, in the ways you describe, he is this quintessential lone dissenter, and he is that way until the very end. So how do we square those two Douglases, right? The public hiker and hollerer, and this kind of loner dissenter, and which set of tactics prove more effective for him in kind of moving this conservation movement forward?
Well, I think in the conservation movement, I think his tactics were very effective. he had what he called committees of correspondence, and that's where you get a whole series of citizens to take on a cause.
I appreciated this nod to earlier.
Yeah, and it goes back, of course, to the Civil War. So these committees of correspondence he creates. So he's really a grassroots activist, and he's very effective at it because he knows that you need a catalyst. And the catalyst is often the protest or something physical. And when he was hiking on the beach in Washington, of course, he has all these people saying, you know, bird watcher, go home. But he's also got the Boy Scouts there, and everybody's kind of shaking hands. He actually wanted the hike to be like a dialogue, like the people against him would hike with him, and the people for him would hike with him. But the people were not actually willing to do that. So he's very effective in that. Now on the court, he's effective from time to time for sure. But it is interesting if you look at how many dissents, he's the lone dissenter. That's where he basically says, I'm going to say my piece, put down my marker, whether it's for the future or something else, and leave it at that. And that's where this statement he makes, I have no soul to save but my own. He also says at one point, supposedly at a law school lecture, that given a choice between the environment and corporations, he would tip to the environment. So that's a pretty remarkable statement, given that we all take an oath, to be fair and to listen to all sides. But there's no doubt that he had a point of view. And, he could be incredibly warm and charming. His wife, Kathy, describes so many points there. The picture on the front of the book was taken by a guy named Charles Wright, who wrote The Greening of America. You're all probably a little later in time, but The Greening of America used to be taught in colleges for sociology and that sort of thing. And Reich was a law professor as well. So people like that, and with the Murrays, he's incredibly tender. But with his colleagues, he's not a chit-chatter, let's put it that way.
But can be that on the trail, right? Can
Totally.
be that in Playboy magazine, this kind
Can
of
be that.
interesting set of contradictions.
And he writes, some of his writing is a little redundant. I mean, he'll take from here to here. And I don't think there's no law against plagiarizing yourself. We do it all the time in opinions. But he would write something about some soliloquy and how he felt about something, and then you see it show up in Good Housekeeping, and then maybe in Red Book, and then maybe National Geographic. So that was his heart speaking, And I think when his heart was speaking, he was at his best. Although he is, keeping in mind, he is a genius. He is a genius.
So you mentioned in this book, right, this is not the first book-length treatment of Douglass, but it is the first that takes up this question of advocacy at the intersection of his judicial decision-making and his work in the public. And you ask us as readers to think about in the preface whether he crosses a line. Mm-hmm. So I thought before I open this up to questions that I would put that question back to you with a slight modification. So, did Douglass cross the line? And here's my modifier. In post-war Washington, during his tenure on the court, what was the nature of that line and who got to define it? So historicize this thing for me.
All right, good question. So as a nod to our historian here, I want to take you back in time to the 40s. And at that time, Supreme Court justices were doing all kinds of things. Frankfurter and Douglass said, the court is a monastery. I would say, that is some monastery you guys are living in, because they don't stay in it. They're out of it all the time. And Frankfurter's advising Roosevelt. We have members of the Supreme Court serving on commissions. Later, we have Justice Jackson, who goes to Nuremberg, which these days we all think is amazing. It was the beginning of international law. But here's a Supreme Court justice turning into a prosecutor. And so some people said, well, that was the war. Well, then we had the Warren Commission. We have a Supreme Court justice doing an investigation into the assassination of a president. So there were instances in history where the justices, there was not a line as we think of now, the separation of powers idea. As you stay in your lane, you're in the judicial lane, the executive, or the congressional. And the Supreme Court was governed by an oath that all federal judges and justices take in terms of being fair and also avoiding the appearance of impropriety. So he was bound by that. But in his mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. And he would tell you this because what he was doing didn't interfere with his work on the court. I would suggest to you that he would have a hard time saying that with a straight face with respect to Sierra Club v. Morton. But he could certainly say that on many other cases, that what he was doing on the weekends and on his vacation was not impacting his view or what he was doing on the court. So he thought about these things. There were some proposals to impose certain ethical standards. And one of them was going to be that somebody could kind of basically have to approve what you wrote outside the court. And he said, that's like censorship. And if you're going to do that kind of ethical thing, how about you make these judges disclose the stock they own? So he was kind of ahead of his time on that question. He didn't own any stock, really. So when he would sign these financial disclosure forms, he filled them out. He didn't refuse, but he kind of like put in a little under protest asterisk on the bottom, you know. So he didn't see himself as outside the law, let's put it that way.
He's also, in a lot of his advocacy, pushing for transparency in other arms of government,
Yes.
right? And ironically, this may be part of his inadvertent legacy that now that kind of transparency is expected on the court.
Right. And the other, I'll say one other thing before we take a question. He had been in the administrative state. Now, keep in mind, in the 30s and 40s, it's kind of a small administrative state. It's growing. But he didn't think that the court should give such deference to the administrative agencies. Well, fast forward, all good law students and others know we have the Chevron case where we give deference to administrative agencies. And now there's a fair amount of discussion as to, are we giving too much discretion to federal agencies, and that the court should step in more in a de novo way. So in a way, Douglas, having been inside the government, didn't think that the court should defer so much to the government.
So would you like to
Yeah,
open it up to
absolutely.
questions? Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask?
Got to go through all these journals. Just, it's incredible. I just spent 2 years in special collections going through someone's journals, including 20 years of email. So trust me, it gets so much worse. But I'm curious, did he ever reflect on or identify moments where he thought he had failed, and or moments where he changed his opinions or kind of reflected on things he would have done differently?
I don't see a lot of that. I will say, you probably should have helped me. His handwriting became more and more difficult to interpret, as you can appreciate. I got pretty good at it. I don't see him as somebody who reflected backwards a lot. He told his law clerk something that I think is just great. He said, get out into the stream of history and swim as fast as you can. And that's where I saw he was looking forward always, as opposed to looking back. Now, as she mentioned, I did not endeavor to do a full biography of Douglas. There's several of those written, and there's actually one in process now by an emeritus professor from Stanford, David Danielski. So we await that at some point. So I didn't try to get into everything, but I will say on the environment, I don't think he ever looked back to think, well, that wasn't a good tactic, or that's not very effective. He was always looking forward to the next challenge, the next piece of nature that was being endangered, or the next case where someone's rights were being trampled. So he really had two overriding principles. One is that the Constitution was intended to get the government off the backs of little people, and that wilderness was a vanishing resource that, if not saved, would disappear. So you see that from his growing up, and then you see it all through as he struggled really to go from a poor kid in Yakima, Washington, to somebody playing at the highest levels of Washington, D.C. And those principles, one thing I would say is he never forgot the little people. He never forgot people or fish.
You seem to have a lot of similarities with Justice Douglas. You're a Westerner. You are also a judge. And I was wondering there are other biographies of Justice Douglas, but what insight do you think you had on this figure through these similarities with him? Because it does sort of come out when you talk about him.
Yeah. Well, certainly I wouldn't pretend any more than other people, but I feel I know the West, that it's part of me. And I knew I would come back West after law school, that it wouldn't stay in the East. So I appreciated that about him. He kept that roots in the West. And of course, I'm a hiker and a mountain climber and all those things. I think maybe the one perspective that I brought that other biographers haven't brought is just that judicial perspective. So I'm looking at it, one, through the lens of judicial ethics, which has really never been written about before with Justice Douglas. And then also, he interests me quite a bit as a judicial figure. I'm on a collegial court. A collegial court, not only because we actually get along with each other, but a collegial court is another word for a court where you need to work with other people to come out with a solution. So I'm very familiar with that process, having been on the circuit for nearly 25 years. And I would say to some degree he squandered some opportunities because he was so smart. And I think he could be convincing in some areas. But if his eye was on getting back out to the trail and to Washington, as opposed to kind of bringing people together, then I would say he missed some opportunities in that regard.
I was going to ask what you see for the future of the rights in nature movement, having reviewed his early writings on that, and whether you think that's still kind of a pipe dream in America, or whether you might see that a legacy of his come to fruition.
Yeah, I think we'll see more and more of it on the local level. And it's consistent with his sense, too, that politics are local. So individual municipalities that are passing these regulations or provisions in their municipal code in order to protect various parts of the environment of the county, I think we'll continue to see more of that. And obviously we're in a crossroads on the environment right now. I think other countries will continue to adopt rights of nature. Whether the courts will adopt it, well, that's for the advocates to come to court and the counter advocates to come to court and to argue, what does that mean in modern day standing? One of the things that I think I was most surprised about when I became a lawyer is how important standing is. I think they blow by it to a degree in law school, but then you get into private practice or government practice and you realize if you can't get into court, it doesn't matter how great your case is. And the same thing is true of jurisdiction. We all have taken these federal jurisdiction classes. And when I got out of law school, I could recite the Civil Procedure Code to you really quite well. But internalizing it to realize, well, what does it really mean for a case to be moot? What if they chop down all the trees? Where's your case? Your case just got chopped down. The trees might have standing, but you don't have any trees to protect. So they don't have any, you no longer have any standing. So I think it's interesting that these, what some people would call technical legal foundations in the law, turn out to be really quite important in reality in the courts. So Douglas realized that. He had some other cases on standing that are important. And I think that as a precursor to the Sierra Club v. Morton, there were some cases that where he wrote that would let you begin to see that this notion of how important the notion of standing is. And that's true, you know, as time has gone on, the court has waxed and waned to some degrees, I mean, the Supreme Court, on how it defines standing and what are the contours of standing. But that remains the door, open or shut, to getting into court. So I think it's going to be quite important. You had a question?
Yeah, so this is very on brand for the Lane Center for the American West, but I wondered if you could talk more about Douglas's legacy as a Supreme Court justice from the West. And you know, you spoke very eloquently about his love of nature and hiking and all of that, but was his jurisprudence affected by Western laws of the Western states? And kind of going forward, do you see his legacy playing out in in the jurisprudence of subsequent Western Supreme Court justice members?
Well, we haven't had many from the West. When you go through the lists, and of course we had from the Ninth Circuit, we had Justice Kennedy, and we now have Justice Gorsuch from Colorado. I would say yes, because if you look at some of his most important cases, when he writes about, for example, a dam on the Snake River, he knows what that is. I mean, you could analytically talk about a dam on a river, but he's been there, you know, he's been on that river or similar rivers. And when he writes about it, he brings all of that alive. That was the only dam the Supreme Court ever stopped, actually. And what did they do? They didn't say, no, you can never build a dam. They said, go back and take another look, almost like a pre-NEPA type of thing. Go back and take another look at this dam situation. So if you go through his cases, when he talks about the fish, absolutely, he understands fish. He's interesting on Native Americans, because sometimes he'll say, I know and I understand the Indians, I grew up with them, I learned from them, and then he'll turn around and say, I don't really necessarily understand them. So, but probably no other justice had even thought about understanding or not understanding Native Americans in the same way. So I think you see in lots of his jurisprudence two things. You see something about the land and about people. And they might not even be people from the West, but he's the kind of guy, when he's on the hike, he's talking to the Boy Scouts, he's talking to so-and-so, he's talking to Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Agriculture. He says, come with me and see, because if you see what I'm talking about, then I think I will convince you of my position. So in some ways, I think that's one of his most lasting legacies, is saying to people that disagree with you about something, come to my world and see what I'm seeing, and then maybe you'll understand. Any other questions?
Do you have any favorite anecdotes about Douglas you gleaned during research that did not make it into the book?
Oh, yeah.
This is a question from another historian.
Yes, right. Well, there's a lot of them, you know. I thought everything was interesting, but then I think, well, I don't know if anyone else will think, you know, this is interesting. Anecdotes. Well, I think, you know, for example, he could be so charming to people, and he, for example, somebody's sick, and he wants to, you know, tell them, oh, I'm so sorry you're sick. Here's a case of whiskey. You know, I don't know if that's what you spend instead of flowers. So he did a lot of those kind of small gratitude things and notes. He was an inveterate note and letter writer. So I'd like to have quoted more of the letters he was writing to people he had never met. So, you know, it wasn't his assistant. He had two secretaries, personal assistants. And he usually only had 2 law clerks. Some of the other justices had more law clerks, but not him. You know, they weren't permitted really to do the opinions at all. He did those, he dashed those off himself. And, you know, there's some other stories too. Well, here's one. He often would give the clerks a drink on Friday night out of his very well-stocked liquor cabinet. And so one day he came back from a trip and they opened the liquor cabinet and the bottle's empty. And he looks at the law clerk, because I think he knows who probably finished it off, and he's really gruff about, what do you think I should do about this? And the law clerk amazingly says, get another bottle of whiskey, you know? And my most favorite law clerk story is that there is a shower in the justices' chambers. And the clerks pretty well knew what the justice's pattern and cycle was for when he came in, when he didn't come in. So he came in one Saturday when they weren't expecting him, and they worked 7 days a week. He only let him off literally when he asked him to go hiking on the CNO Canal. So they were working 7 days a week, but they also sometimes would go upstairs and play basketball. And one guy left his clothes in the justice's shower, and the justice just reamed him out, you know. And the assistant said, you know, he'll fire you, but don't pay any attention to that. Just come back the next day and then it'll be like nothing happened. So this particular law clerk had a lot more courage and guts than I would have. He did it again as he used the justice's shower, you know. So Douglas would routinely fire law clerks, but then tell them, come back. He didn't say another word. So you would be fired, but you're not really fired. So I didn't tell all those stories, or even all the good stories, but you know, he is a people person in so many ways, apart from the nature, that he does have a lot of good people stories. And I also wasn't there to dig into his personal relations, let's put it that way. I read many things, but didn't feel that really fit within the scope of what I was doing. But you know, as an historian, you can spend hours going down a rat hole which has no relevance, but it is interesting, right? And one of my former colleagues, Betty Fletcher, on the Ninth Circuit, was his lawyer. So I read all of her correspondence with him, totally irrelevant to my book, but interesting. So that I found at some point I had to stop and quit doing that, because I would find things that are interesting that don't really have anything to do. And the other thing is, at the Library of Congress, the correspondence is alphabetical and by subject matter. So you can find yourself great subjects to read on. The impeachment, for example, a very interesting topic. But that's not the core of my book, except to say that he survived impeachment. But I read all of that and what they accused him of and what his response was and his lawyers. So all those stories, they're still either in somebody else's biography or at the Library of Congress for you to go look at.
That seems like the perfect place for us to leave this. And I want to say thank you to the audience, to the Lane Center for hosting, to Magdalene for coordinating, and most especially to you, Judge McKeown. This is just such a fun book to read. And for people who are intrigued by the law, intrigued by the environment, want to be motivated to get outside, I strongly encourage you to pick this up. I couldn't put it down. So
Well,
thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really do want to thank the Lane Center and the History Department and the law school, because it's always a pleasure to be here. And just remember, when you're not studying, get out on the trail.